The ferocious dragons couldn't keep their calm despite their best efforts, and the tension from Helen and Kenneth's argument lingered heavily over the dinner table. Helen changed the subject by asking Sophie about her day at school. Sophie, contrary to her usual temperament, replied softly and in a sweet tone. Sophie knew that the argument had gone way too far. Jacob ate quietly and listened to their conversation. He noticed how alike Sophie and her mother looked. Usually, Sophie had a short temper, and Helen was the cool and composed one. But today, it seemed that they had switched roles. Kenneth, on the other hand, ate his food noisily, still trying hard to suppress his displeasure for Jacob. Sophie's father, Dracon, seems to be a wise man with good leadership skills. In contrast, his brother Kenneth seems reckless and stubborn. He has handsome features just like Dracon, but there is something ghastly about his appearance. I bet it comes from his constant grouchiness. Jacob eyed the man, judging him. Sensing Jacob's judgment, Kenneth raised his head and suddenly glared at Jacob. His bloodshot eyes scared him. After that glare, Jacob didn't dare look up even once. Sophie and Helen were done talking by the time dinner was over, and they began to clear the table. Helen asked Sophie to go upstairs with Jacob to study. It was understood that Helen wanted the two to spend time together. But Sophie wasn't in the mood.
I just finished eating, Mom. I want to watch a bit of TV. No, Jacob is here to tutor you, not to sit by while you watch TV.
Helen said firmly, leaving no room for discussion. Sophie had just come from school and was in no mood to study, but she obediently climbed up the stairs to her room. Each loud thud of her footsteps made Jacob giggle. Sophie's face turned red whenever she got angry, which Jacob found adorable. She also flared her tiny nostrils, making her look even cuter. Jacob couldn't help but smile at the sight. Jacob laughed, grabbed the study material, and followed her upstairs. He didn't think of Sophie as his fiancée, but as a sassy girl he liked being around. Unexpectedly, Kenneth began following them upstairs. Helen stopped him and asked,
Why are you going upstairs?
No reason. I just like the view from the top window. Kenneth scratched his head and answered as he continued to climb. It was obvious that he was worried about leaving Sophie and Jacob alone. And so, he followed them to keep an eye on Jacob. He also wanted to see how smart this mortal really was, and if he could actually teach Sophie anything. Helen clearly knew what Kenneth was trying to do. He wanted to go upstairs to kill the mood, but she couldn't do anything about it. She sighed and left the room. Jacob followed Sophie and entered her bedroom. He turned around when he heard Kenneth behind them. He rolled his eyes and muttered under his breath, "I'm not going to eat her up." Sophie didn't care about any of this. She just didn't want to study. She reluctantly sat at her desk. Jacob unzipped his bag, took out a test paper, and put it in front of her. Let's start with this practice test.
I have a lot of assignments to do today.
Sophie looked at Jacob with concern. We can do them after this, I promise. Jacob said in an encouraging tone.
Huh.
Sophie gave in. She took the test paper from him, grabbed a pen, and frowned as she got to work. Jacob had worked hard on the practice test, picking questions from a variety of sources to make a basic test for Sophie. He wanted to gauge how much she knew. Sophie bit the tip of the pen and did the questions one by one. Jacob dragged a chair, sat beside her, and looked at her quietly. Sophie's Uncle Kenneth sat on a chair right at the entrance of the room and watched the study session unfold. He tried to get a peek at the questions, but the grammar rules gave him a headache. Kenneth quietly went back to his seat to glare at Jacob. Jacob ignored him and focused on Sophie. After half an hour, Sophie finished the simple test. Jacob took it from her, checked it, and within 2 minutes, he discovered that Sophie's English was extremely poor. Watching Jacob making big red marks all over her test paper, Sophie couldn't hold back.
Hey, I got so many questions wrong.
You scored only 20 points out of 100. Jacob handed her the paper.
You made it hard on purpose.
Sophie's face went pale as she looked at her paper. Okay then. Jacob took the test paper back, placed it on the table. Let's officially start the tutoring session. Sophie knew she needed the help, but felt embarrassed in front of Jacob. You did the second question wrong. Finish is a verb, and you need to polish it with the adverb quickly. And over here it says that it's faster than other people. So it should be more quickly, not more quick. Jacob pointed at the second question that she got wrong. Sophie blushed.
I know, I was careless and read it wrong.
Jacob went on with his corrections. You need to use in for the proposition before the year, the month, the season, and the week. When talking about the date specifically, use on. If it's the particular arrival time, such as 5 o'clock, use at.
I know this too. I wasn't paying attention.
Sophie quibbled. And the fourth question, sixth question, seventh question, eighth question. Jacob explained the questions one by one, but Sophie was trying to give excuses and was slowly running out of them. She said that she read the question wrong, or the question wasn't clear enough. All in all, she couldn't admit that her grammar was poor. In the end, even Kenneth couldn't sit still. He coughed 2 times. Soph, you need to pay attention more in class.
Uncle, his test is way too difficult.
Sophie's face was bright red. Jacob was speechless. These questions were the simplest and most basic questions for high school English. Even first-year high school students could probably answer half of the questions. Kenneth had a bad temper, but he wasn't stupid. He looked at Sophie and knew that she had a bad foundation in English. Even he couldn't help but admit, I think you need some tutoring.
Uncle.
Sophie whined as her face turned red, the kind Jacob found endearing. Jacob hid a smile. Kenneth stood up. It's about time I leave. Your father should be back soon, Soph. I'll head back now so your father won't nag me.
Uncle, you're scared that my father will give you a lecture, aren't you?
Sophie seemed chirpier as he teased her uncle. Kenneth felt a bit embarrassed at his outburst earlier that evening. He shrugged. Anyhow, I'm going back home now.
Okay, I'll see you off.
Sophie jumped out of her chair. You can just walk me downstairs. Kenneth said as he walked out of Sophie's bedroom. He didn't even look at Jacob before leaving, let alone say goodbye. Jacob was now alone in Sophie's bedroom. He could hear Sophie's voice as she talked to her uncle.
He's not as bad as you think, Uncle. He's a sweet guy.
Jacob smiled at the words coming out of Sophie's mouth. Helen seemed to have joined the conversation as she said,
Leaving Kenneth? Dracon is almost back home. You don't want to say hi to him?
I'll come to see him another time. I just came to meet Sophie today, he replied.
You're afraid that he'll say you're not working on cultivation hard enough, right? Well, drive safely on your way back,
said Helen kindly. Jacob was relieved to hear the main door shut, which indicated that Kenneth had finally left. Sophie came into the room a couple of minutes later and directly began complaining.
Jeez, Jacob, you made me look so bad in front of my uncle. I didn't do it on purpose. You actually got the questions wrong,
he said innocently.
Couldn't you pretend that I answered them correctly?
She looked at Jacob angrily. Jacob couldn't hide his smile this time. Sophie smiled back at him.
I think your Uncle Kenneth hates me,
Jacob confided in her.
Don't take it personally. He doesn't like any mortals.
Sophie was terrible at consoling. Jacob didn't know what to say, but his impression of her Uncle Kenneth grew even worse.
He just thinks that you're not a good match for me. You don't have to worry. He just says things, but he won't actually do anything to you.
Sophie was straightforward.
I actually still don't know much about you guys. What exactly was the spirit concentration scroll that Elder Liam gave me the last time?
Jacob asked her.
That's the most basic cultivation technique. It doesn't actually do anything. It's simply for the purification of your body.
Sophie looked at Jacob.
You've been cultivating for so many days now, and yet it seems like your body has had no reaction.
It was now Sophie's turn to act bossy, because cultivation was her area of expertise.
Didn't we have a deal? I tutor you, and you teach me the cultivation technique. If I cultivate poorly, it means that you are a bad teacher.
Jacob said immediately.
Nonsense! I never taught you before.
Sophie glared back at him.
Then you can start now.
Jacob sat down and looked at her. He seemed sincere, and so Sophie began talking.
The cultivation techniques in the Dragon Clan are divided into... 8 levels. The highest level is called the Heavenly Level. Anyway, that's all you need to know right now. You're not even on the elementary level yet. After your body powers up to a certain level, my father or Elder Liam will pass on the real cultivation technique to you. And when you cultivate and reach the final level, you will officially become a cultivator.
Listening to her vague yet complicated explanation, Jacob guessed that her cultivation was probably not that remarkable. In fact, Jacob was right about that. Sophie was totally uninterested in the cultivation techniques, and only cultivated because she had to. She did have a desire to prove herself, but she was just plain lazy. That was why she made a mistake when she created the rain, which led her to fall into Jacob's arms. Jacob finally understood why Helen and Dracon wanted to punish Sophie for her carelessness. He also understood why they wanted him to spend time with her. It had more to do with just marriage. They wanted Sophie to be safe and become responsible. Keeping his thoughts aside, Jacob decided to continue with his questions.
Are there any dangers for me to learn your cultivation technique?
Jacob was genuinely concerned about this.
Of course there are dangers. You could break your arms or legs if you fall. You could even lose your life on the spot.
Sophie said in a serious, no-nonsense tone. Jacob looked scared.
It's a good thing now, isn't it? You can be my replacement, and it'll be a lot easier for me.
She giggled and teased Jacob. Sure, I can be your replacement. I can face all the dangers instead of you. You are marrying me anyway. I can cultivate and share the core with you. You know, when we... Jacob gave Sophie a sly smile. In response, Sophie swung her fist toward Jacob.